The Kansas plains stretched endlessly beneath a sky choked with smoke, and Commander Thaddeus Blackwell stood at the observation post knowing that what remained of civilization depended on the next 72 hours. 3 miles east, a mass of writhing bodies moved like a living tsunami across farmland that had once fed millions. The dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps more. Satellite imagery had stopped being reliable 6 weeks ago when the infection consumed the technicians at NORAD. Now, Thaddeus relied on binoculars, instinct, and the exhausted men and women behind the hastily constructed barricades of Fort Redemption. He lowered the binoculars and glanced at Lieutenant Marlowe Ashford, a woman whose sharp features had been carved harder by sleepless nights and impossible decisions. Marlowe had lost her entire family in Atlanta during the first wave. She never spoke of it, but Thaddeus had seen her staring at a photograph she kept folded in her breast pocket. That photograph was her fuel, her reason to keep fighting when reason itself had abandoned the world. "They'll be here by nightfall," Marlowe said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what approached. "Maybe sooner if they maintain their current pace." Thaddeus nodded. The infected didn't tire. They didn't need food, water, or rest. They simply moved, driven by an insatiable hunger that defied every natural law. The scientists who had tried to understand the pathogen were among the first to turn. Dr. Ezra Thornfield, the CDC virologist embedded with their unit, believed the infection was engineered, something released deliberately or escaped from a weapons facility. It hardly mattered now. Understanding wouldn't stop what was coming. Behind them, Fort Redemption bustled with controlled chaos. Soldiers reinforced firing positions, checked ammunition stores, and tried not to think about the fact that every simulation, every tactical analysis, predicted their complete annihilation within 48 hours of engagement. The fort wasn't even a proper military installation. It had been a high school 3 months ago. The football field was now a helicopter landing zone. The gymnasium served as a field hospital where medic Soren Whitlock worked miracles with dwindling supplies. Sergeant Kenna Voss approached at a jog, her dark hair pulled back in a tight braid, dirt smudged across her cheekbone. She'd been overseeing the southern defensive line, where 1,200 soldiers prepared to face an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't surrender, and couldn't feel fear. Kenna had been a promising athlete before the world ended, a marathon runner with Olympic aspirations. Now she ran between defensive positions, carrying orders and ammunition with equal urgency. "Commander, the civilians are getting restless," Kenna reported. "They can see the Horde from the western windows. Some are demanding we evacuate them further inland." Thaddeus felt the weight settle deeper into his bones. 15,000 civilians sheltered within Fort Redemption's walls. Refugees from a dozen overrun cities, people who had walked hundreds of miles with nothing but the clothes on their backs and hollow hope in their eyes. There was nowhere left to evacuate them to. Denver had gone dark 2 weeks ago. The broadcasts from the West Coast had devolved into screams before cutting to static. Texas reported massive casualties. The government, whatever remained of it, operated from aircraft carriers in the Atlantic, issuing orders that bore no relation to the reality on the ground. "Tell them we hold here," Thaddeus said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "Tell them the American army doesn't abandon its people." Kenna's jaw tightened, but she nodded and departed to deliver the lie they both needed to believe. Private Dalton Grayson manned the .50 caliber machine gun on the northeast tower, his young face aged beyond his 22 years. He'd enlisted to pay for college, dreaming of becoming an engineer. Now he dreamed of nothing but the faces of the infected, their milky eyes and blackened veins, their mouths hanging open in silent hunger. Dalton hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in over a month. Captain Reverie Kane moved through the ammunition depot with practiced efficiency, her clipboard a talisman of order in a world defined by chaos. Before the outbreak, Reverie had been a logistics officer at Fort Bragg, coordinating supply chains across 3 continents. She understood numbers, patterns, and the cold mathematics of warfare. The calculations she performed now offered no comfort. They had enough ammunition for perhaps 18 hours of sustained combat. After that, they'd be reduced to melee weapons against an enemy that felt no pain. "We're rationing the M67 grenades," she informed Corporal Finian Cross, who supervised the distribution teams. Finian was a quiet man, introspective, with gentle hands that seemed wrong for a soldier. He'd been a music teacher in his previous life, conducting middle school orchestras. Now he conducted the deadly symphony of explosive ordnance. 1 grenade per squad unless the situation becomes critical. "Ma'am, the situation is already critical," Finian replied, not disrespectfully, simply stating the obvious truth they all carried. Reverie allowed herself a thin smile. More critical, then. The depot was actually the school's basement, concrete walls lined with metal shelving that groaned under the weight of ammunition crates, medical supplies, and MREs that would outlast everyone in the fort. Bare bulbs cast harsh shadows, and the air smelled of gun oil and human fear. Private Yara Novak worked nearby, her hands moving rapidly as she sorted rifle magazines, ensuring each was fully loaded and functional. Yara had been a competitive shooter before the outbreak, a girl who'd grown up hunting deer in Montana with her grandfather. She understood weapons intimately, could field strip an M4 blindfolded, and had more confirmed kills against the infected than anyone else in the fort. "Captain Kane," Yara said without looking up from her work, "I've been thinking about the incendiary rounds. If we concentrate them with the sharpshooters, we might create fire breaks in the Horde. Panic them, maybe." "They don't panic," Reverie replied, though she appreciated the tactical thinking. "They don't feel fear." "They burn though," Yara countered, finally meeting Reverie's eyes. "They burn just fine." It was true. Fire had proven one of the few effective tools against the massive hordes. But starting fires on the Kansas plains in late summer was inviting disaster. The wind could shift, the flames could spread, and they'd be trapped between an inferno and the infected. Still, desperation bred innovation, and they were beyond desperate. General Magnus Holloway arrived at the depot entrance, his uniform still crisp despite everything, his bearing military perfect. Magnus was old guard, a veteran of 3 wars before this one, a man who'd commanded divisions and planned invasions. He'd been at the Pentagon when it fell, had barely escaped in a helicopter as the infected swarmed through the corridors of American military power. He carried that failure like a scar across his soul. "Captain Kane, Commander Blackwell requests your presence at the command center," Magnus said. His voice was gravel and authority, the kind of voice that expected instant obedience. Reverie handed her clipboard to Finian and followed the general up the stairs and through the corridors that still smelled faintly of teenage sweat and cafeteria food. The command center occupied the principal's office and adjoining conference rooms. Maps covered every surface, marked with red zones that spread like cancer across the nation. Radio equipment crackled with sporadic transmissions from other holdouts, each one a voice crying out in the darkness. Thaddeus stood over a topographical map of the surrounding area, Marlowe beside him, both studying the terrain with the intensity of chess masters facing an unbeatable opponent. Dr. Ezra Thornfield hunched over a laptop in the corner, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting streams of data that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. "We've identified a choke point," Thaddeus said as Reverie and Magnus joined them. He pointed to a dried riverbed about 2 miles east. "If we can funnel them through here, we reduce their ability to overwhelm us with sheer numbers. That requires forces outside the fort," Marlowe added. "A forward position to drive them toward the riverbed. It's a suicide assignment." The briefing room fell silent as the weight of Marlowe's words settled over everyone. A suicide assignment. In the old world, such a mission would have been carefully planned, extensively debated, perhaps ultimately rejected as too costly. But the old world was dead, animated now only in memory, and the new world demanded sacrifices that would have been unthinkable before the outbreak. Thaddeus straightened, his shoulders carrying the burden of command with visible effort. "I need volunteers," he said simply. 50 soldiers to establish a forward firebase at the riverbed. Your objective is to create a kill zone and drive the main body of the Horde into the choke point. You'll be exposed, outnumbered, and the extraction window will be narrow. Dr. Ezra Thornfield looked up from his laptop, his face pale in the flickering fluorescent light. "Commander, I must emphasize that exposure to the infected carries a 98% infection rate upon fluid contact. A single bite, a scratch, even blood spatter into the eyes or mouth." "We know the risks, Doctor," Magnus interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. Ezra fell silent, returning to his data, seeking answers in numbers and viral loads, some explanation for how humanity had fallen so far, so fast. The call for volunteers went out within the hour. Sergeant Kenna Voss was among the first to step forward. She stood in the assembly yard, surrounded by soldiers whose faces reflected terror and determination in equal measure. Kenna knew she should be afraid, she was afraid, but fear had become such a constant companion that it no longer controlled her actions. Her family was gone, consumed in the chaos of Kansas City. She'd watched her younger brother turn, had seen his eyes cloud over and his humanity drain away like water through a broken dam. A corporal had shot him before Kenna could, a mercy she both appreciated and resented. Private Dalton Grayson volunteered next, climbing down from his gun tower to add his name to the list. His hands shook slightly as he signed, but his jaw was set with determination. He'd been writing letters to his mother, even though mail service no longer existed, even though his mother was probably dead. The act of writing kept him sane, kept him human. He folded the latest letter and tucked it into his pocket, a message that would likely never be read. Private Yara Novak surprised no one by volunteering. She approached Marlowe directly, her rifle already slung across her back, additional magazines weighing down her tactical vest. "I want to be in the forward position," she said flatly. "I can shoot." "You need shooters." Marlowe studied the younger woman, seeing something of herself in Yara's hard eyes. "This isn't glory, Private. This is buying time for people who might not survive anyway." "Nothing's glory anymore, Lieutenant," Yara replied. "It's just survival and seconds. I'll take a few more seconds." Corporal Finian Cross volunteered with quiet resignation, his decision surprising many who knew him. The gentle music teacher turned soldier had always seemed more suited for support roles than frontline combat. But Finian understood rhythm and timing, understood how individual parts created a greater whole. If the forward position failed, the entire defensive strategy collapsed. He would hold his position and play his part until the final note. By evening, 53 soldiers had volunteered, 3 more than needed. Thaddeus made the agonizing decision to select the final roster based on combat experience and tactical skills. The 3 who were cut looked devastated, as though being denied the right to face probable death was a personal failure. Such was the psychology of the apocalypse. Medic Soren Whitlock insisted on accompanying the volunteer force, despite not being a combat soldier. Soren was in his early 30s, with prematurely gray hair and hands that trembled only when he wasn't working. He'd been an emergency room doctor in Chicago before the outbreak, had treated the first wave of infected when everyone still believed it was a new strain of rabies or some exotic disease. He knew the truth before most: this was extinction level, this was the end of the human story unless they fought for every chapter, every paragraph, every word. "You're needed at the field hospital," Thaddeus argued when Soren presented himself with the volunteers. "The field hospital will be overwhelmed regardless of whether I'm there," Soren countered. "The forward position will have casualties. Immediate trauma care might mean the difference between extraction and abandonment." It was sound logic, and Thaddeus reluctantly agreed. Soren joined the roster, bringing medical supplies that seemed pathetically insufficient for what awaited them. Captain Reverie Kane worked through the night, ensuring the forward team had optimal equipment distribution. She calculated ammunition loads, distributed the precious incendiary rounds, and prepared contingency supplies for every scenario she could imagine. The mathematics of survival consumed her, equations of bullets and bodies, theorems of time and tragedy. Dawn broke over Fort Redemption with deceptive beauty, the sky painted in shades of amber and rose that seemed obscene given what the day would bring. The volunteer force assembled in the staging area, 53 soldiers checking weapons, adjusting body armor, and avoiding each other's eyes. To look too closely at a comrade was to see the fear you were trying to suppress, to acknowledge the probability that this farewell was permanent. Thaddeus moved among them, offering words that felt inadequate but necessary. He shook hands, gripped shoulders, tried to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. These were his people, his responsibility, and he was sending them to probable death because strategy demanded it. The weight of command had never felt heavier. Marlowe led the final briefing, her voice crisp and professional as she outlined the tactical objectives. You establish position at grid coordinates Tango 74 by 0800 hours. Heavy weapons set up along the northern ridge, sharpshooters distributed for maximum coverage. When the Horde reaches the 2-mile marker, you begin selective fire, driving them south toward the choke point. When they're committed to the riverbed approach, you radio for extraction and fall back to designated pickup zones. Helicopter support will have exactly 7 minutes on station before fuel considerations force withdrawal. 7 minutes. Everything would hinge on 7 minutes and whether 53 soldiers could disengage from hundreds of thousands of infected in that impossibly narrow window. Kenna listened to the briefing while mentally running through her own preparations. She'd said no goodbyes because there was no one left to say goodbye to. Her squad was her family now, these exhausted soldiers her brothers and sisters in the only bond that mattered, shared survival. She caught Dalton's eye across the staging area and offered a small nod. He returned it, his young face trying for bravery and almost achieving it. Yara checked her rifle for the 15th time, muscle memory and ritual providing comfort. She'd zeroed the scope yesterday, fired 100 practice rounds to ensure absolute familiarity with the weapon's behavior. In the coming fight, hesitation would mean death. Certainty, precision, and speed were the only advantages they possessed. Finian said a silent prayer, words from his childhood when faith seemed simple and God seemed close. He wasn't sure he believed anymore, wasn't sure any benevolent deity would permit what had happened to the world. But the words themselves held power, a connection to who he'd been before the outbreak, before he'd learned to kill without thinking. The convoy rolled out at 0700, 6 armored personnel carriers, 2 supply trucks, and a fuel tanker. They moved through the fort's eastern gate, through barriers that would be sealed behind them, past civilians who watched with hollow eyes that held no illusions about what was happening. The soldiers were riding toward the approaching horde, toward the inexorable tide of death that had consumed civilization. The landscape they traversed showed the scars of collapse. Abandoned cars littered the roadside, some burned out, others simply stopped when their drivers fled or turned. A farmhouse stood empty, its door hanging open, dark stains on the porch that could have been old blood or just weathering. Fields that should have been heavy with late summer crops stood wild and overgrown, nature already beginning the process of reclaiming human spaces. They reached the riverbed position with 20 minutes to spare. The dried channel cut through the plains like a scar, steep banks that would funnel the infected into a narrow approach. It was good defensive terrain, the kind of position that would be ideal if they were facing a conventional enemy. Against the infected, it was merely less terrible than open ground. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, establishing firing positions, setting up the M2 Browning heavy machine guns, creating overlapping fields of fire. Soren established a casualty collection point in a depression behind the main line, laying out medical supplies with hands that were steady now, focused by purpose. Yara took position on a small rise with 3 other sharpshooters, her rifle barrel resting on a bipod, her breathing already slowing into the meditative calm of a sniper preparing for engagement. Through her scope, she could see the horizon, could see the distant dark smudge that was the approaching horde. Kenna moved among the positions, offering final checks and quiet encouragement. She found Dalton struggling with the feed mechanism on his machine gun, his hands made clumsy by nerves. "Hey," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "You've got this. You've done it 100 times." "Never with this many coming," Dalton replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Same principles," Kenna assured him. "Short, controlled bursts. Aim for center mass. They go down like anything else when you destroy enough tissue." It was cold comfort, but Dalton nodded, finally getting the feed mechanism locked properly. Kenna squeezed his shoulder and moved on, carrying her facade of confidence like armor. The horde became visible to the naked eye at 0920, a dark mass that stretched across the horizon like a storm front. Through binoculars, the individual infected resolved into nightmare detail, shambling figures in torn clothing, their movements jerky and wrong, their faces masks of decay and hunger. Some were fresh, newly turned, still possessing a horrible mimicry of human coordination. Others were weeks or months into decomposition, held together by the mysterious pathogen that reanimated dead tissue and drove it forward with relentless purpose. Marlowe's voice crackled over the radio from Fort Redemption's command center. "Forward position, be advised, aerial reconnaissance estimates horde strength at 400,000 plus. Repeat, 400,000 plus. Main body will reach your position in approximately 40 minutes. 400,000. The number was too large to comprehend, too vast to process in any meaningful tactical sense. Kenna looked along the defensive line at 53 soldiers and knew that mathematics alone condemned them. Even perfect accuracy, even unlimited ammunition, couldn't overcome those odds. Their purpose wasn't to win but to redirect, to buy time measured in minutes and paid for in blood. "Remember the mission," she called out to nearby soldiers. "We're not stopping them. We're steering them. Shoot the flanks, drive them toward the center, funnel them into the choke point." The waiting was agony. The infected came on with inhuman patience, never rushing, never slowing, simply advancing like a tide governed by forces beyond human understanding. Dalton watched through his gun sights, watched the mass of bodies flow over terrain, watched them stumble through obstacles and rise again, indifferent to falls that would have broken living bones. Finian's hands gripped his rifle with white-knuckled intensity. He could almost hear it as music, the rhythm of their approach, the terrible tempo of apocalypse marching toward its crescendo. He'd conducted students through difficult pieces, had taught them to trust the rhythm, to let the music carry them. Now he prepared to trust his training, to let muscle memory and drill carry him through what was coming. At 20 minutes out, the smell reached them. 400,000 rotting bodies created a miasma of decay that rolled ahead of the horde like a bow wave. Soldiers gagged, covered their faces, fought the urge to vomit. Soren distributed surgical masks, knowing they'd do little against the stench but providing psychological comfort at least. At 10 minutes out, individual infected could be distinguished. A woman in a tattered business suit, her throat torn open, one arm hanging by threads of tendon. A man in mechanic's coveralls, his intestines trailing behind him, somehow still mobile despite catastrophic injuries. A teenager, perhaps 16, her face pale and her eyes milky white, her mouth opening and closing in silent hunger. Each one had been a person once, had possessed dreams and fears, loves and losses. The pathogen had reduced them all to the same base function, consume. "Weapons free in 60 seconds, Kenna announced, her voice carrying across the position. "Sharpshooters, begin target selection. Heavy weapons, prepare for sustained fire. Riflemen, fire discipline, make every shot count." Yara had already selected her first target, a large infected male near the front of the horde's northern edge. She controlled her breathing, calculated wind speed from the movement of dry grass, adjusted her aim point for the 300-meter distance. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, waiting for the command. "Fire," Kenna ordered. Yara's rifle barked, the recoil familiar and manageable. Through her scope, she saw the infected's head snap back, saw him crumple. She was already acquiring her second target before the first hit the ground. Around her, the other sharpshooters opened fire in steady rhythm, each shot precisely placed, each bullet finding a target. The heavy machine guns joined seconds later, their deeper roar creating a thunderous bass line to the sharper cracks of rifle fire. Dalton pressed his butterfly trigger, sending .50 caliber rounds into the northern edge of the horde. Bodies jerked and fell, catastrophic damage overwhelming even the pathogen's animation. He fired in controlled bursts like Kenna had taught him, managing his barrel temperature, conserving ammunition, staying disciplined despite the terror. The horde didn't react to the gunfire with fear or anger, only minor adjustment. The infected in the kill zone fell, were trampled by those behind them, creating obstacles that the horde flowed around like water seeking the path of least resistance. Which was exactly the intent. The heavy fire concentrated on the edges drove them toward the center, toward the riverbed approach, funneling 400,000 bodies into the tactical choke point. Finian fired methodically, each trigger pull a conscious decision, each shot aimed and deliberate. He'd killed infected before, but never like this, never in such overwhelming numbers that individual deaths became meaningless except as contributions to the larger tactical goal. He tried not to think of them as people, tried to see them only as targets, as threats to be neutralized. 30 minutes into the engagement, the strategy was working. The horde's main body had committed to the riverbed approach, hundreds of thousands of infected packed into the narrow channel, creating the dense target zone that Fort Redemption's defensive positions could most effectively engage. But success came with cost. The forward position was nearly surrounded, infected spreading around their flanks despite the concentrated fire, drawn by the noise and movement of living humans. "Lieutenant, we're being flanked on the south side," Kenna reported over the radio, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "Estimate 2,000 infected, closing within 100 meters. Marlowe's response was immediate. "All positions, prepare for extraction. Helicopter support inbound, ETA 4 minutes. 4 minutes. An eternity when measured against the shambling approach of the infected. The soldiers began their fighting withdrawal, each squad providing covering fire while others fell back toward the designated pickup zones. The discipline held, barely, soldiers trusting their training even as instinct screamed at them to run. Yara continued firing, dropping infected with mechanical precision even as she backed toward the extraction point. Her ammunition was running low, each magazine precious. She'd switched to headshots exclusively, conserving bullets, knowing that only catastrophic brain damage stopped the infected permanently. Dalton's machine gun ran dry, the belt feeding through with finality. He abandoned the weapon, too heavy to carry, and pulled his sidearm, continuing to fire as he retreated. An infected woman in a nurse's uniform stumbled toward him, arms outstretched, jaw hanging broken and askew. He put 2 rounds into her forehead and watched her collapse, felt nothing except grim satisfaction at one more threat neutralized. Finian stumbled over debris in the riverbed, his rifle slipping from his hands. He scrambled to retrieve it, aware of infected closing from multiple directions. Hands grabbed his combat vest, hauling him upright. Kenna was there, firing past him, buying him the seconds needed to recover his weapon. "Move, Corporal," she shouted, and they ran together, sprinting for the rally point where the rest of their squad was forming a perimeter. Soren had 2 casualties at his position, both bitten during the engagement. Protocol was clear, infection was a death sentence, anyone exposed had to be terminated before they turned. But looking at Private Torres, a young man clutching a mangled forearm, tears streaming down his face, Soren couldn't bring himself to follow protocol. Not yet. Not while the soldiers still had human eyes. "Please," Torres whispered. "Please, I don't want to turn." Soren administered a lethal dose of morphine, watched the young man's breathing slow and stop, watched the light fade from his eyes. It was mercy, the only mercy left to offer. The second casualty was already gone, glassy eyes staring at nothing, fingers beginning to twitch with the first stages of reanimation. Soren put a bullet in his brain and tried not to think about the fact that 4 hours ago they'd shared coffee. The helicopters appeared like salvation, 3 Black Hawks coming in low and fast, their door gunners already firing into the mass of infected surrounding the extraction zones. They touched down for exactly 7 minutes as promised, soldiers scrambling aboard while gunners provided covering fire, the thunder of miniguns drowning out everything else. Kenna did a head count of her squad as they boarded, came up 1 short. Dalton. She scanned the chaos, spotted him 50 meters out, limping badly, infected closing from 3 sides. Without thought, she jumped from the helicopter and ran toward him, her rifle barking as she fired, clearing a path. "Come on," she screamed, grabbing Dalton's arm, half carrying him as they ran for the helicopter. The infected were so close she could hear their ragged breathing, could smell the rot. Hands grasped at her, fingers catching her vest. She spun, fired point-blank into a decayed face, kept moving. They reached the helicopter with seconds to spare, hands pulling them aboard as the pilot lifted off. An infected managed to grab the landing skid, was carried up 30 feet before losing its grip and falling back into the seething mass below. Dalton was pale, going into shock. Kenna looked for wounds, found his leg torn open, blood soaking through his fatigues. "Medic," she shouted, though Soren was already moving toward them, his medical bag open. The wound was deep but clean, no bite marks, just trauma from falling debris. Soren worked quickly, applying pressure, stopping the bleeding, his hands steady despite the helicopter's violent maneuvering. Dalton would live. Today at least. The extraction wasn't perfect. 7 soldiers didn't make it to the helicopters, were overrun in the final moments, their screams cutting through the radio chatter before falling silent. 53 had gone out. 46 returned. The mathematics of survival continued their brutal calculation. The helicopters touched down at Fort Redemption as the leading edge of the Horde reached maximum effective range of the defensive positions. The volunteers stumbled from the aircraft, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. They'd bought the time needed, had funneled the Horde exactly as planned. Now came the real test, whether the fort's defenses could hold against 400,000 infected compressed into a kill zone. Thaddeus watched from the command center as the infected poured into the riverbed approach, exactly as the forward team had driven them. The defensive positions opened fire with every weapon available, artillery, heavy machine guns, automatic rifle fire creating an overwhelming wall of lead. The infected fell in waves, bodies piling upon bodies, the pathogen's reanimation overwhelmed by sheer physical destruction. But they kept coming. For every dozen that fell, 100 more pressed forward, climbing over their fallen, driven by hunger that transcended death itself. The ammunition stores that Reverie had so carefully calculated began to deplete at alarming rates. The M67 grenades, rationed so carefully, were deployed in desperate clusters as infected reached the outer barriers. General Magnus Holloway coordinated the defensive sectors with decades of military experience, shifting resources to weak points, reinforcing positions under pressure. But even his expertise couldn't overcome the fundamental mathematics. They were being overwhelmed by attrition, by an enemy that accepted any casualty rate because death meant nothing to the already dead. Yara was back on the walls, her rifle growing hot from sustained fire. She'd lost count of her kills, the numbers becoming meaningless. Headshot after headshot, the mechanical rhythm of breathing and triggering, breathing and triggering. Beside her, soldiers she'd trained with, eaten with, survived with, fought with the same desperate intensity. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent, hours bleeding together in continuous combat. Ammunition levels dropped to critical. Soldiers began fixing bayonets, preparing for melee combat that everyone knew would be the end. You couldn't fight 400,000 infected hand-to-hand and survive. Dr. Ezra Thornfield worked frantically in his makeshift laboratory, still seeking answers that might matter. He'd isolated the pathogen, understood its basic structure, knew it was engineered. But the cure, the vaccine, the solution, they remained tantalizingly out of reach. Science required time, and time was the one resource they'd exhausted. As afternoon turned to evening, something unexpected happened. The infected stopped coming. The riverbed, choked with bodies stacked meters deep, had become an impassable barrier even for the Horde. The infected at the rear, driven by simple hunger rather than tactical thinking, couldn't navigate the mass of destroyed bodies. They milled at the edge of the kill zone, unable to advance, unwilling to retreat. A stalemate. Temporary, fragile, but real. Thaddeus allowed himself a moment of hope, quickly suppressed. They'd survived today, but ammunition was nearly gone, soldiers were at the edge of collapse, and the infected weren't defeated, merely delayed. Tomorrow, or the next day, they'd find another approach. The Horde was patient. It could wait forever. That night, Kenna sat with the survivors of the forward position, none of them speaking, all of them staring at nothing. They'd done the impossible and survived, but survival tasted like ashes. The 7 who hadn't made it back haunted the silence. Private Torres, who died by Soren's merciful needle. The others, whose final moments Kenna tried not to imagine. Dalton limped over, his leg heavily bandaged, and sat beside her. "We made it," he said quietly. "Some of us," Kenna replied. Marlowe found Thaddeus on the observation post after midnight, both of them too exhausted to sleep, too traumatized to rest. The plain before them was a graveyard, tens of thousands of bodies visible in the moonlight, a monument to survival purchased at terrible cost. "We can't hold another assault like that," Marlowe said softly. "I know," Thaddeus replied. "So what do we do?" Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment, then pulled a folded document from his jacket. "General Holloway received this transmission 3 hours ago. From the carrier group in the Atlantic. They've established a secure zone in Greenland. Minimal infected population, defensible terrain, sustainable resources. Evacuation?" Marlowe's voice held fragile hope. "For some. They can take 15,000 civilians, 3,000 military personnel. We have 15,000 civilians here alone, and 1,200 soldiers." The cruel mathematics reasserted themselves. Not everyone could be saved. Choices would have to be made, lives weighed and measured, and some found wanting through no fault of their own. "When?" Marlowe asked. "Transports arrive in 72 hours. We hold until then." 72 hours. An eternity and an instant. Over the next 3 days, Fort Redemption prepared for evacuation while maintaining defensive readiness. The Horde probed for weaknesses, testing different approaches, and each probe was repelled with dwindling ammunition and increasing desperation. Soldiers fought with the clarity of those who'd accepted death, and perhaps that acceptance made them more effective. They asked for no quarter and gave none. Soren worked endless hours in the field hospital, treating wounds that in the old world would have been routine but in the new world were often fatal for lack of proper supplies. He saved who he could and eased the passing of those he couldn't, his morphine supply now his most precious resource. Reverie managed the impossible logistics of evacuation, determining who would go and who would stay based on criteria that haunted her, skills needed for rebuilding civilization, genetic diversity, age and health factors. She was playing God, and the weight of it was crushing. She selected herself to stay, unable to board a transport when her decisions condemned others to remain. The transports arrived on schedule, massive C-17s landing on the makeshift runway that had been the football field. The evacuation was orderly, military discipline holding against panic and desperation. 15,000 civilians boarded, clutching children and the few possessions they'd carried through the apocalypse. 3,000 military personnel, selected by criteria that seemed arbitrary to those left behind. Kenna was selected to evacuate. She refused. Her squad, what remained of it, was staying to hold the fort during the final evacuation. She wouldn't abandon them. Dalton was selected based on his age, his potential for rebuilding. He accepted, limping aboard with tears streaming down his face, clutching the letters to his mother that he'd written faithfully. Yara was selected for her skills. She also refused, choosing instead to remain on the walls, her rifle ready, protecting the evacuation with the same precision she brought to everything. Finian evacuated, carrying nothing but his memories and guilt at surviving when so many hadn't. As the final transport lifted off, Thaddeus stood with those who remained, 800 soldiers, 5,000 civilians who couldn't be accommodated, and the cold knowledge that they'd bought 72 hours at tremendous cost and now faced an ending that was never in doubt. The Horde, patient and inexorable, began its final assault as the last transport disappeared into the evening sky. The soldiers of Fort Redemption fixed bayonets, chambered their final rounds, and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Marlowe stood beside Thaddeus on the wall, both of them watching the infected approach for the last time. She pulled the photograph from her breast pocket, the one of her family, and looked at it briefly before tucking it away. "Do you think they made it?" she asked, meaning the evacuees. "I think we gave them a chance," Thaddeus replied. "That's all we could do." As darkness fell and the infected reached the walls, the soldiers of Fort Redemption sang. It started with one voice, a old hymn from before the world ended, and spread along the defensive line, hundreds of voices joining in defiant beauty. They sang of home and hope, of sacrifice and sorrow, their voices rising above the moans of the infected, a final assertion of humanity in the face of extinction. Kenna sang with them, her rifle firing between verses, tears on her face but her voice steady. Yara sang, her fingers never ceasing their deadly work. Soren sang, administering final doses to the wounded who wouldn't survive the night. Reverie sang, her calculations finally done, her numbers reduced to this simple equation: they would hold until they fell, and in holding, they would save those who remained. The last transmission from Fort Redemption came at 0347 hours, a brief message from Commander Thaddeus Blackwell: perimeter breached. Position untenable. We hold the line. Tell them we held the line. Then silence. The carrier group in the Atlantic received the message, logged it officially, and noted Fort Redemption as lost. 15,000 civilians and 3,000 military personnel had been successfully evacuated. The cost of that success was 800 soldiers and 5,000 civilians who'd remained behind, who'd made the stand that allowed the transports to escape. On Greenland, in the secure zone that represented humanity's desperate hope for continuation, Dalton wrote another letter to his mother he knew was dead. He wrote about Kenna's bravery, about Soren's compassion, about Yara's precision and Finian's quiet strength. He wrote about Commander Blackwell's leadership and Lieutenant Ashford's determination. He wrote about the thousands who died so that he could live, and he wept as he wrote, survival feeling less like victory and more like unbearable burden. Finian taught music again in the new settlement, working with children who'd been born into apocalypse and knew nothing else. He taught them old songs, songs from the world before, trying to preserve something of what had been lost. When he conducted, he sometimes thought of Fort Redemption, of the final hymn sung on the walls, of voices rising in defiance of death. The survivors carried their ghosts, carried the weight of those who hadn't made it, carried the knowledge that their survival had been purchased with blood and sacrifice. They built their new society on the foundation of the old world's ending, trying to ensure that the cost hadn't been paid in vain. But on quiet nights, when the wind blew cold across the Greenland ice, they could almost hear it, 800 voices singing on distant walls, holding the line one final time, a hymn of humanity echoing across the frozen distance. The American army had faced the relentless zombie horde and made their stand. Some survived. Most didn't. In the mathematics of apocalypse, that counted as victory. But the victory tasted of ashes and sorrow, of lives ended and loves lost, of a world that had been and could never be again. The survivors would rebuild, would carry on, would honor the fallen by living. Yet in their hearts, in their dreams, in the spaces between breaths, they remained forever on those walls, singing with their fallen brothers and sisters, holding the line that had saved them and cost everything. The battle was over. Humanity persisted. But the price of that persistence was measured in names like Thaddeus, Marlowe, Kenna, Yara, Soren, and Reverie, names of heroes who'd stood against the darkness and refused to yield, who'd given everything so that others might have a chance. In the end, survival wasn't about who won or who lost. It was about the choice to fight, to hold, to sacrifice, even when the outcome was never in doubt. Fort Redemption fell. But what it defended, hope, humanity, the possibility of tomorrow, endured. And somewhere, in memory and in spirit, the defenders still held the line. Always.